When Eisenhower suggested to General Marshall that I command the 1st American Army Group in France, he foresaw that someone should replace me as commander of the 1st Army, the commander of one of his armies. Eisenhower wrote, referring to the moment when I would become commander of the Army Group in France, will probably be Patton. The other army will be commanded by a general who distinguished himself in the invasion of France, and in extreme cases Hodges or Simpson, provided, of course, that the intended candidate can arrive in time in England and together with Bradley will take part in the invasion from the beginning. When Eisenhower told me of his choice, I was pleased with both candidates. Either one was a worthy candidate. At the time, I didn't yet know that I would get them both. An unsuccessful classmate of Patton's at West Point in 1904, Hodges failed in his second year of maths. He was declared unfit for military service. However, the quiet Georgia native knew himself better. He enlisted as a soldier in 1906 and was promoted to officer 3 years later. In February 1943, when Lieutenant General Walter Kruger was recalled from the Third Army and sent to MacArthur's command in the Pacific, Hodges was transferred from his post as commander of the 10th Corps to San Antonio, where he received his 3rd star. A month before the Third Army was sent to England, Hodges left there at the disposal of the First Army. As deputy commander of the First Army, Hodges oversaw the Army's preparations for the invasion and substituted for me during the landing. He took command of the Army on the day I became Army Group Commander, that is 1st August 1944, and led his army from Avranches to the Elbe. He still wore the identification of that army 4 years later, when he retired and settled in Texas. A skinny, quiet Georgia native, Hodges was a poised, unflashy, and seasoned man. This is why he did not come to the forefront during the war in Europe. Hodges was first and foremost a military man who knew his business impeccably, a specialist in tactics, which put him among the most talented generals under my command. He probably knew as much about infantry tactics and combat training as the other officers. However, because Hodges was unpretentious and kept a low profile, his role in the war was almost invisible. Nevertheless, with Hodges could rival among our American commanders only Simpson. In Hodges successfully combined flexibility of mind and common sense, resulting in a great and balanced commander. I certainly trusted his judgment, skill, and restraint. Of all my army commanders, he was the least in need of my control. Hodges' talent as a commander is evident from the achievements of his First Army. This army advanced across Europe with serious and stern determination, not relying on instinct, as did Patton's Third Army, or on luck, like Simpson's Ninth Army. The First Army was the first to cross the German frontier, the first to cross the Rhine, the first to reach the Elbe and link up with the Russians. It captured more Germans during its offensive than any other American army. It also suffered more casualties than any other army during its long offensives. Because Eisenhower had finally decided to conduct the invasion with 5 divisions, the first echelon of our First Army was increased from 1 division to 2, and the British forces were increased from 2 to 3. 1 American division landed on the coast of the Department of Calvados. To the right of the British, 32 kilometers west of Cayenne. The other division landed on the east coast of the Cotentin Peninsula to hasten the capture of Cherbourg. The landing sites were 30 kilometers apart, separated by the Carantana estuary. Here we had to connect our landing sites and create a common bridgehead. The landing of the divisions of the first echelon was led by the commanders of the respective corps. The 3rd Corps was in the 2nd echelon and landed in the gap between the above 2 sites. The Carantana estuary landing site was known by the conventional name Omaha, to the right was Utah. As Jarrow's 5th Corps arrived in England early, it was given the Omaha site for landing. In fact, Jarrow began to develop a plan for the Corps invasion from the moment he received a copy of Cossack's first draft of Operation Overlord. At Devers' request, 2 additional corps were transferred from the United States along with their commanders. The 7th Corps, commanded by Major General Roscoe Woodruff, directed the landing of troops in the Utah section. The 19th Corps, commanded by Major General Willis Crittenberger, was in the 2nd echelon and landed following Jarrow's corps at the Omaha site. Although the Normandy landing at Omaha was Jarrow's first major test, I had no hesitation in entrusting him with the command of the landing. Jarrow was not only a conscientious, confident and persistent general, he was also well versed in all the details of the plan for the invasion of France. As for Crittenberger and Woodruff, this was their first time participating in an amphibious operation. Eisenhower and I doubted the advisability of assigning the responsibility for leading the American invasion force to 3 inexperienced generals. Both Crittenberger and Woodruff arrived in England with impeccable credentials, both of whom I had known for many years. However, neither of them had been in combat during the Second World War. That was what my only objection to their nominations boiled down to. Certainly they deserved to test their mettle, and I would have been happy to have either or both of them together under my command, however, in a less demanding operation. While we both, Eisenhower and I, puzzled over how to get out of the situation, the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force received a radiogram from General Marshall. In the United States were 2 division commanders who had been in battle, who had experience of the war in the Pacific, and were suitable for the position of corps commanders. Marshall asked us if these generals were suitable candidates. We answered in the affirmative, so had to sacrifice Crittenberger and Woodruff to guarantee the success of the invasion across the Channel. Crittenberger was sent to Italy and Woodruff to the Pacific. Both became corps commanders and distinguished themselves in battle, thus showing that our fears were unfounded. One of the officers suggested by General Marshall was a native of Louisiana, Major General J. Lawton Collins. Commanding the 25th Infantry Division, Collins replaced the Marines on the island of Guadalcanal and quickly cleared it of the enemy. Collins had been known in the Army for many years as one of the outstanding young officers. Collins proved too young for the war in the Pacific. Vivacious in his 64 years, MacArthur preferred to have officers close to his age in command. The 48-year-old Collins seemed too young for him. Thus, if Collins was too young to command a division, then hardly MacArthur would trust him to command a corps. In the European theatre, however, most of us had the permanent rank of lieutenant colonel, and our general stars were temporary. Obviously, Collins could promote himself best in Europe. Collins was one of the most distinguished commanders in Europe and no doubt also the most energetic. Having carefully selected his staff, he made impeccably correct tactical decisions, implementing them with enough courage to ensure the success of all his actions. He was not only energetic, but also infinitely self-confident. Such self-confidence can only be tolerated in men who turn out to be right, and Collins, fortunately, was almost always right. Major General Charles Corlett was the 2nd commander recommended by General Marshall. Commanding the 7th Infantry Division during the assault on Kwajalein Island, Corlett landed his troops on shore quite skillfully. He did not storm the island head-on, but first seized an atoll at the lower end of the island, on which there was a small enemy force. There he positioned his artillery, which began shelling the landing sites on the island through a narrow lagoon. In 7 days of fighting, Corlett's troops destroyed more than 8,000 Japanese, losing only 286 men. As a reward for his successful actions in the Pacific, Corlett was appointed commander of the 19th Corps. Unfortunately, he had a stomach ailment, and after 5 months of war in Europe in December 1944, Corlett was forced to resign as Corps commander and went to the United States for treatment. Only after the landing in France, Eisenhower managed to ensure that before sending to our disposal from the United States corps and division commanders, along with their units, to seek our consent in advance. We did not object to most of the candidates for division commanders, believing that, having prepared their divisions in the United States, they have the right to test them in battle. Washington, however, was also sending corps commanders from the United States to our disposal, who, having not been in combat, were supposed to be in charge of division commanders with combat experience. As long as these newcomers continued to come to us, each with his own corps staff, we had no opportunity to nominate worthy division commanders for corps commander. "We are unfair to our division commanders," I once said to Ike. "Once a division commander has done something wrong, we either demote him or send him to the United States. However, if a division commander is an excellent commander and worthy of promotion to corps commander, we have no way to promote him." Ike nodded his head. "I know what you mean, Brad. If we punish the bad, we should reward the deserving. It would be good if we had the ability to select corps commanders before they are sent out of the United States, and take only those who are right for us. In that case, some corps headquarters would come to us without their commanders. For the vacant corps commanders, we could nominate division commanders." This proposal was accepted, and before the end of the war, 11 division commanders became corps commanders. At the same time, in the United States, one corps commander voluntarily gave up a corps and took command of a division to be able to go overseas. Eisenhower left Patton to brood in the requisitioned palace at Palermo throughout the autumn of 1943. George, now commander of an army without an army, was chastised by Ike for a notorious hand-to-hand incident. As the winter rains made the Sicilian landscape increasingly bleak, a remorseful Patton fell into melancholy. He feared he would have to rot on the island he had conquered. Ike, however, had not forgotten George, although he condemned him for the incident that had led to his discredit. Eisenhower's faith in Patton's fighting qualities did not diminish. "What a character, Patton, damn him," once said one officer. "It gives him the opportunity to win brilliant victories and at the same time gives him a lot of trouble." Although Patton sometimes caused trouble, nevertheless Eisenhower considered him a worthy commander. I learned of Eisenhower's proposal to appoint Patton as commander of the army only after Ike's arrival in England. Had Eisenhower asked my opinion of the appointment earlier, I would have opposed it. Not only did I question the propriety of Patton's actions during the Sicily campaign, but I seriously questioned whether it was wise to subject Patton to the suffering of a role reversal with me. In Sicily, Patton had been my superior. Now we were reversing roles and I was becoming his superior. Ike assured me that George would accept this without bitterness. The only thing he wants is to be involved in the war again. At one time he thought it was over for him. Like Eisenhower, I did not dispute Patton's excellent offensive abilities, and between the English Channel and Berlin there was room to spread out. However, even this brilliant talent of Patton could not suppress doubts in me when he became my subordinate. I did not inform Eisenhower of my misgivings. If Eisenhower wanted Patton, I should not have objected to him. To this day, I cannot remember without chagrin how I hesitated to learn of Patton's appointment. When George became my subordinate in August 1944, he accepted it simply, amicably, without hurt ego, bitterness, or resentment. The year of service together. with Patton in Europe will remain one of the best memories of my military service. George arrived in England in March 1944, along with key officers from 7th Army Headquarters. He located 3rd Army HQ in central England, away from the south where preparations for the invasion were well underway. Since the headquarters of the 3rd Army remained without troops until the landing in France, the latter was assigned to the headquarters of the European Theatre of Operations, and George was under the care of Eisenhower until August. But not much time passed, and George again put himself to shame. In an English town nearby was opening a club for Allied soldiers, and George was suddenly invited to speak. Instead of confining himself to the well-known truths about Anglo-American friendship, George went further. The idea behind the organization of such clubs, he said, is most timely, for we are surely destined to rule the world. If this had been said by a local chatterer, there would hardly have been any response. But it was Patton himself who spoke, and when his statement was made public, it quickly caused a great international outcry. Unfortunately, Patton's statement was overlooked by the censor because it did not violate military secrecy. Overnight, Patton's ill-conceived statement became a matter of national importance, and no one was more surprised by it than the repentant culprit himself. The Senate postponed consideration of the recommendation that Patton be promoted to the permanent rank of Major General. All the newspapers in the United States were scathing about the supreme command of the Allied Expeditionary Force in leading articles. However, again, as in Sicily, Eisenhower repelled the wolf pack. Again, George apologized. This time Eisenhower noted with irritation that his patience had reached its limit. "I'm fed up," he said in a conversation with me about Patton. "If I have to apologize publicly for George one more time, I will remove him from office, no matter how valuable he is to us. I'm sick and tired of defending Patton. Life is too short to waste it on stuff like this." 15 months later, Patton forced Eisenhower to fulfill his promise. As commander of the 3rd Army occupying Germany, he had violated an order from the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force forbidding the use of former Nazis in rebuilding railways and public works. Disregarding political considerations, George believed that only German officials who had worked during the war were suitable for these positions. But that they might turn out to be Nazis was of less concern to Patton, who was primarily concerned with rebuilding these industries. Explaining his actions to the press, George caused a sensation by saying, "Well, I'll explain to you who the Nazis are. Their strife is like the fight between the Republican and Democratic parties during an election." George assured that he hated the Nazis more than anyone else. However, he immediately ascertained from his experience with the military administration that Germans who were not hired usually declared that Nazis were lodged in all the posts. More than half of the Germans were Nazis, and it's damned hard to sort out which ones are not Nazis. Eisenhower carried out his threat. George was removed as commander of the 3rd Army and sent into exile in the 15th Army. From the latter remained only a paper headquarters, engaged in compiling a report on military operations. Friends of George Patton claim that he experienced this ingratitude until his death. Eisenhower, however, is the least to be blamed for ingratitude. Twice before he had saved Patton, though he could easily and justifiably have been free of him. Eisenhower undoubtedly showed great courage in defending George Patton. Undoubtedly he forgave him much. Most commanders in his place would not have done so. Few generals could surpass Patton as a military leader. However, Patton had one enemy he could not defeat, and that enemy was his tongue. It was this ability of Patton to create serious crises that forced me to increase my censorship as soon as he became my subordinate. The press liaison officers will curse me for this, I said to Bill Keane. But to hell with them, I have no other choice. Tell the censors not to let any statement from any commander go to the press without my visa. I want to preview all their press appearances myself. The strict fulfillment of this prohibition is evident from the following episode. During the battle in the Ardennes, shortly after the liberation of Bastogne, I was called to the telephone. "We have recorded General McAuliffe's words," said the officer at the other end of the line. "Can we pass them on to the press?" "What did he say?" I asked. "Fuck you," was the reply. Advocating the landing of troops on the Cotentin Peninsula to ensure the rapid capture of Cherbourg, I persuaded Montgomery and Smith to drop an airborne landing deep along the coast. The Utah landing site was wide and flat and therefore suitable for a sea landing, but access inland was restricted by several narrow causeways crossing flooded marshland. As long as the enemy held the causeways, he could hold us at the Utah section. Although I would like to organize a landing at Utah, I told the planning officers at Cossack headquarters, I would rather abandon the operation than risk the lack of airborne support. Moreover, in order to capture Cherbourg and prevent the danger of delaying the accumulation of our forces in the bridgehead, it was important to prevent enemy reinforcements from moving into Cherbourg. For this purpose, we should have cut the peninsula at its narrowest part. If the enemy had been able to move his troops to the peninsula before we break into Cherbourg, it is difficult to say how long it would have taken us to capture the port. Had the Germans been able to hold out at Cherbourg until September, the bad weather in the Channel would have posed a serious threat to the supply of our troops if supplies had to be unloaded directly onto the shore. There are two main railways running from Normandy to the Cotentin Peninsula towards Cherbourg. One runs at the base of the peninsula through Carentan, the other along the west coast. Between these roads, 2/3 of the base of the peninsula is cut by the River Douve. To isolate the peninsula, we were to first seize the neck of the peninsula at Carentan and entrench ourselves on the Douve River to the west coast road. We were then to cover the 15-kilometre gap between this road and the sea. These tasks were assigned to the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. The 101st Division was thrown out in the area north of Carentan, in the rear of the Utah section. It was to keep the exits from the Utah section open and prevent the enemy from blowing up the dams. At the same time, the division was moving south to Carantana to link up with Jarrow's troops who had landed on the Omaha section. The 82nd Division was given an even bolder task. It was to cut the western coastal road leading to Coutances and close off the western part of the Cotentin Peninsula. Unlike the 101st Division, this division was thrown out at quite a distance from our naval landings. We hoped that if the division was not spread out over a large area, it would be able to hold out until our ground troops approached from the bridgeheads. Both commanders of airborne divisions agreed without objection to the tasks assigned to them. At meetings with Montgomery in the building of the School of St. Paul, which developed the initial version of throwing out airborne troops, Lee Mallory had no objections to the plan. On the contrary, he even suggested throwing out the 82nd Division further south, close to the Lally-du-Puy Road junction. But I disagreed, preferring to take a stronger position 10 kilometers to the north. Later, however, Lee Mallory suddenly changed his view, suggesting that we should not throw in airborne troops to support the landing at the Utah site. Not only did he object to the planned approach of aircraft to the landing zone from the west coast, but he considered the airborne landing itself an unreasonable risk. "I can't approve of your plan," Lee Mallory said. "It's a very risky venture. You will suffer too great and unjustifiable losses." Unfortunately, General Bradley, I cannot agree with you. Very well, sir, I replied. If you object to an airborne landing, then I must decline to land at the Utah site. I cannot land troops on the coast unless I am sure that the exits from the coast are in our hands. Lee Mallory cast a quick glance at me. I want to make it clear, he said. If you insist on throwing out airborne troops, you do so without regard to my objections. With these words, he leaned back in his chair, turned to Montgomery, and added, "If General Bradley persists, he must take full responsibility. I personally do not believe in the success of the airborne operation." "I fully agree with that statement," I replied. "I'm used to taking responsibility for my actions." Montgomery lightly tapped the table. "There is no need for that, gentlemen," he said. "I take responsibility for the operation." Having obtained Monty's agreement, we proceeded to further plan the airborne operation in the Utah section. Lee Mallory, however, continued to oppose the operation. If his fears were justified, then the landing of a Marine landing at the Utah site could have been jeopardized by the failure of the airborne landing. There was too much at stake, so he appealed to Ike, asking for changes in the airborne landing plan. Eisenhower asked for my opinion on the concerns of the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. "Of course there is a risk," I agreed, "but it is much less than the risk to which our troops would be exposed in the case of landing on the site Utah without the support of airborne troops." I agreed that Lee Mallory's C-47s, which have a low ceiling, would be immediately exposed to anti-aircraft artillery fire as soon as they appeared over the coast of France. Landing gliders in the hedgerow-strewn fields of Normandy was difficult and could lead to heavy casualties. However, I insisted we must take this risk, in view of the importance of landing at the Utah site and the possibility of quickly capturing Cherbourg. Of course, I did not want to jeopardize 17,000 paratroopers if we could do without them. However, I deliberately took the risk to ensure the success of the maritime landing. That was the crux of the matter. Eisenhower analyzed the irreconcilable views of his ground and air commanders. Then, when the fate of the entire invasion operation across the Channel was at stake, he spoke in favor of the airborne landing on the site Utah. Meanwhile, Lee Mallory was still not giving up. Taking on the mission to save us from disaster, he made one last appeal to Ike. In the end, not Lee Mallory, but the Germans themselves forced us at the last moment to make changes in the plan to throw airborne landing on the site Utah. At the end of May, the Assistant Chief of Intelligence Department of the First Army, Major Robert Lowe, told us the sad news about the arrival of enemy reinforcements in the area south of Cherbourg. Agents' data was confirmed that in this area moved 3 German divisions, and therefore for the landing Ridgway created a serious threat. If we failed to break through from the landing site of the Marine landing deep into the peninsula, then the 82nd Division would be destroyed in their highly vulnerable positions. We had no choice, and had to change the 82nd Division's landing area, bringing it closer to the coast. On 26 May, Matthew Ridgway and Max Taylor, commanders of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, flew to Bristol to make last-minute changes to the plan. The dark, window-blocked operations room at Clifton was already filled with boxes of documents from 1st Army HQ preparing for the invasion. We hastily made changes to the plan. The 101st Division had the same mission as before, but the 82nd Division was now being thrown north of the 101st Division, a short distance from the Utah landing site. The division was to seize the crossroads at St. Mare Église and repel possible counterattacks from the northwest. On the same day that the modified airborne landing plan was being sent out, Lee Mallory once again approached Ike at his command post in Portsmouth. Lee Mallory was proposing that the airborne landing at the Utah site be abandoned and that instead an airborne landing be dropped in the Cairn area. He believed that we would lose 50% of the parachutists and 70% of the gliders if we stuck to the approved plan. Eisenhower was dismayed that once again it came to a problem that he thought had long been settled. If Lee Mallory turned out to be right, then Eisenhower would be responsible for these losses. On the other hand, by following the advice of his Air Force Commander-in-Chief, he could jeopardize our landing at the Utah site. Eisenhower retired to his tent to make a final decision. Later that evening, he stated that the airborne landing should proceed as planned. I learnt of this last appeal later, already in France. Eisenhower, however, did not have to choose between two possible options for the airborne drop at the Utah site or in the Cairn area. The question was different: either the airborne landing in the Utah area, or we do not make the landing of naval landing in this area at all. In organizing the most significant operation of the whole war, Ike would never have decided to abandon the landing at Utah without risking defeat. Before I arrived in England, the 29th Division had already claimed the Omaha landing site. This division had arrived in England in October 1942. It was commanded by a former cavalryman, the irascible 48-year-old Major General Charles Gerhard. His enthusiasm sometimes took precedence over a soldier's sound judgment. When Operation Overlord provided for the landing of naval troops also in the south, we decided, along with the 29th Division, to land the 4th Infantry Division. However, although both divisions had already undergone considerable landing training, neither division was yet under fire. Not wishing to run the risk of landing two untrained divisions, I decided to replace one of them with a division that had been in combat. In England, there was only one division that had combat experience in landing operations. It was the 1st Infantry Division. It was by this time fed up with heroic deeds and wanted to return home. When the division learnt that they were facing a third landing, this time in France, the soldiers began to complain bitterly about their fate. Among the infantrymen who had survived the two campaigns in the Mediterranean, only a few believed that a lucky star would help them survive the third campaign. I did not want to subject the 1st Division to further hardship, but as commander I had no other choice. I had to land the troops, establish myself on the bridgehead and destroy the Germans. In carrying out this task, I hardly had to be overly squeamish. I was forced to use the best troops at my disposal to minimize risk and to succeed by any means necessary. As a result, a division that deserved to be rewarded for past trials now had the inevitable lot of carrying out the most difficult task. Though it may seem unjust, it would be better for each man to bear as much of the hardships of the journey as he could bear, than to expose the army to the risk of defeat through a desire to lay on all the same military trials. The troops landing at the Omaha section were to make contact with the British troops on the left and link up with their troops at the Utah section. If both of these tasks were assigned to one division, its front would stretch for 40 kilometers. At the same time, after the arrival of subsequent echelons on the bridgehead, the 1st Division would have to be assembled on the Omaha section in one particular place to avoid congestion on the coast, which would be inevitable in cross movements of troops landing on the Omaha section. In the first echelon of troops, I included 2 regiments of the 1st Division and 1 regiment of the 29th Division. Thus, the 1st Division concentrated its troops on the left side of the bridgehead, the 29th Division on the right. The 3rd Division, arriving at the bridgehead, was located in the center. In order that the troops to be landed could get acquainted with their army commander, as well as to check their combat training, in the spring of 1944, I travelled all over the southwest of England, inspecting 11 divisions intended for the invasion of France. I visited all the companies and batteries of these divisions in a wide variety of terrain, from the bleak, heather-covered heaths of Dartmoor to the steep green heights of Cornwall. I did not want to interfere with the normal course of the exercise and so ordered the divisional commanders not to make any changes to the routine in order to impress me. Only in one division was my order disobeyed, where the battalion commander made the company re-attack the enemy. As I watched the soldiers moving in suspiciously good order, I guessed that the drill was being repeated and asked the battalion commander about it. When he admitted that the company was conducting the attack a second time, the division commander relieved him of his position. There was too little time left to waste on inspections. During my inspection of Gerhardt's 29th Division, I found that the mood of the troops was depressed for fear of heavy losses during the landing. Some even spoke of 90% casualties. At a general meeting of the division's officers and NCOs, I spoke about our losses in the Mediterranean, hoping to dispel their exaggerated fears. All this talk of colossal losses is rubbish, I told them. Some of you will not return, but very few. A few days later, an enterprising reporter from the Stars and Stripes visited the division. He saw a copy of my statement. A fortnight later, I had already found my statement in newspaper clippings sent from the United States. I was annoyed that they quoted my speech, delivered without preparation and addressed only to my soldiers. I was also upset that my statement was contrasted with the gloomy predictions of Churchill, Roosevelt, and General Marshall. A month after the landing in France, we released our casualty figures. The American people were relieved to learn that the losses were lower than expected. Of the 55,000 soldiers who landed on the first day of the invasion, we had lost 4,649 men, 1/3 of them killed, the rest wounded or missing. Some years after the war, the mother of an infantryman who had been in England before the invasion reminded me of a statement I had made. I made that statement to reassure my soldiers, I said, to reassure them that they would not all be killed in crossing the Channel. I am glad that this statement has become known in the United States, she said. You cannot imagine how it has reassured our family, who were in a state of extreme anxiety. When these lines are read by the unfortunate censor, whom I have ordered to be severely chastised for getting my statement into the United States press, may they bring him at least some comfort. By the spring of 1944, the hospitable cities of southwest England were overflowing with American troops. American soldiers filled the cobblestone streets of Devonshire villages, drank all the beer in the local pubs, and had love affairs with English women. Indeed, nowhere did Anglo-American friendship blossom more lushly than in the homes of English fathers with their lovely unmarried daughters. The Yankee invasion of England was well supported by dollars. An American soldier was paid 3 times as much as an English soldier. An American staff sergeant sent home to his family as much money as a captain in the English army received. As the Americans spent a large part of their income on girls, it is not surprising that the habits and customs of the English province underwent an unexpected change. One must give credit to the politeness of the English, which they had enough for the whole time of the stay of American troops in England. In the preparation of any amphibious operation, measures to build confidence of success are more important than measures to concentrate troops, accumulate amphibious assets, and increase air power. When the number of invasion troops across the Channel was increased to 5 divisions in the first echelon, our scepticism dissipated and we perked up. This time I was no longer tormented by the doubts that had plagued me during the invasion of Sicily. I had already had the experience of one invasion and was now free from all anxieties in preparation for the second. On his first visit to the operations room of the First Army headquarters in Bryanston Square, Eisenhower emphasized with particular force the need for confidence in the success of the invasion. "The operation is planned for success," he said. "You cannot for a moment doubt the successful outcome of the operation. I assure you that failure is impossible." As our preparations unfold, even the most hardened skeptics would agree with him. I have already warned my staff officers that under no circumstances should they show the slightest sign of doubt or hesitation. The manifestation of the slightest skepticism on the part of senior commanders could grow to disastrous proportions in division, regiment, and battalion. But to inspire this confidence in success, the plan must be exemplary. As the plan for Operation Overlord took final form, we were already confident that we would succeed. On 7th April, Monty arranged a dress rehearsal of the invasion of France on the map. The rehearsal was attended by the commanders of air, land, and sea forces. There were a total of 2 such rehearsals, attended by Eisenhower and Churchill. The second rehearsal was also attended by the King of England. A relief map of Normandy, as wide as a street, was unfurled on the floor of a large hall in the St. Paul's School building. With rare skill, Monty traced the 21st Army Group's plan of maneuver across the map, strutting right across the map of France. In the first echelon of Allied troops landed 2 airborne and 2 infantry divisions of the Americans, 1 airborne and 3 infantry divisions of the British, with the British troops under the command of Dempsey. Once entrenched on the Normandy coast, the First Army was to combine the Omaha and Utah landing sites and establish contact with Dempsey's troops operating on the left. While the First Army was advancing deep into the Cotentin Peninsula to prevent enemy reinforcements from the east from approaching Cherbourg with the further task of capturing the port of Cherbourg, the British Second Army was seizing the railway junction of Caen on the first day of the invasion and expanding its bridgehead to the south. Then the American troops, relying on the British positions, made a wide bypass maneuver, advancing on Paris. As we advanced first in the southern and then in the eastern direction, we isolated the Brittany Peninsula along with its ports occupied by the enemy. The task of clearing the Brittany Peninsula of the enemy was assigned to the Third Army. Meanwhile, we were completing our turn and came to a 225-kilometre-long line facing the Seine. The left flank of this boundary was adjacent to the English bridgehead, the right uncovered flank to the Loire. In the future, we had to develop an offensive on the Seine, where, according to our calculations, the Germans had to organize defense on the opposite bank of the river. During the fighting in Normandy, the British and Canadian armies had to divert enemy reserves, constraining them on the eastern flank of the Allied bridgehead. Thus, while Monty chained enemy reserves at Caen, we had to break through his front in the west and deep bypass maneuver to reach Paris. From the point of view of national pride, such a diversionary mission was a sacrifice for the British, for while we were advancing to bypass the outer flank, the British troops had to sit in place and restrain the Germans. In strategic terms, however, this division of labour was quite logical, for it was towards Caen that the enemy reserves would rush as soon as they heard the alarm. The enemy could not but reckon with the danger of an English advance on Caen. From Caen to the Seine in a straight line is less than 80 kilometres, to Paris only 200, and to the Siegfried Line about 500 kilometres. Even greater fears of the enemy should have caused the open nature of the terrain. Behind the Caen stretched slightly hilly terrain, representing an ideal territory for the action of tanks. Therefore, you cannot blame the Germans that they were inclined to believe that Monty's intention to break their front in the area of Caen and develop an offensive towards the German border. We wanted to give the Germans that impression. If the enemy sent his reserves to the Cayenne area, it would be easier for us to fulfill our task. When Monty spoke at the San Pol school about his plans for the capture of Cayenne, he was very optimistic. Pointing to Falaise, he claimed that his tanks would break through to that town on the first day of the landing. The distance from the coast to Falaise by road was only 50 kilometers, and it took Monty 63 days to get there. Thereafter, Monty convinced me to try to make the breakthrough with tanks, advancing from the Omaha landing site. I knew it would be difficult to carry out such a maneuver, however. I devised a plan accordingly. As I anticipated, we never even attempted to implement the plan. Unlike Monty, I foresaw that we would meet strong enemy resistance on the Normandy coast. Monty forbade smoking during the meeting at St. Paul's School, even though it dragged on. After announcing a 10-minute break, Monty smirked when he smelled a suspicious odor of tobacco. "When we reconvene, gentlemen," he said, "you may smoke if you wish." Laughter was heard in the room, for Prime Minister Churchill and Eisenhower were to attend the meeting after the break. I had only seen Churchill twice before that time. In the early spring of 1944, I accompanied Churchill and Eisenhower on a 3-day inspection of American divisions. The 69-year-old Prime Minister, who had been a war correspondent during the Anglo-Boer War, walked briskly across the fields, smiling at the soldiers from beneath his famous bowler. Every evening while dining on his personalized train, he would talk over whiskey and soda about the hardships and vicissitudes of the war. Churchill had previously been opposed to an invasion across the Channel. Now he regarded it with enthusiasm. During an inspection of the 9th Division, Churchill admitted that he was dying to shoot the new American carbine. Immediately, targets were set up for Churchill, Eisenhower, and me. My target was placed 70 meters away, Eisenhower's at 45 meters, and the Prime Minister's 20 meters away. We quickly fired 15 rounds each. Manton Eddy had the foresight to take us away before we had a chance to look at our targets. Once the Prime Minister invited several senior Allied officers to lunch at his residence at 10 Downing Street. Knowing Churchill's habit of going to bed late, I had already reconciled myself to this when I noticed a note on the invitation card: confidential. The King may be present. "That's good," I said to Ike. "Maybe we'll get home early." The King, however, was in no hurry to leave. After lunch, we moved to the living room, where he chatted casually with us about the upcoming operation. Ranks were forgotten for the time being, and the King seemed particularly grateful to us for the informal nature of the evening. For the first time, I realized what a lonely life a monarch must have, and how difficult it must be for him to have friends outside the circle of his family. We parted at 2:30 in the morning. Unlike the invasion of Sicily, where we landed in order to disguise the approach of our ships to the coast at 3:30 a.m., the landing in Normandy was timed to dawn. When landing on the coast of France prepared for defense, we expected that our firepower would more than compensate for the lack of camouflage. We sacrificed the stealth of the approach to the coast in favor of a more accurate and powerful bombardment. By setting the hour of landing after dawn, we doubled the effectiveness of our Air Force bombing on the coast. During the night before dawn, night bombers of the British Air Force suppressed enemy defences on the coast. As soon as they finished processing the coast, with dawn struck American heavy and medium bombers. The fleet could also better correct the fire of the main caliber artillery in daylight. This in itself was extremely important, for the ship's artillery had the primary task of supporting the landing. In order to make the most effective use of the Air Force and the fleet, we decided to land the landing craft no sooner than half an hour after dawn, and no later than an hour and a half after dawn. Had the landing been made later, the enemy might have recovered from the bombardment by the British Air Force. Moreover, every extra minute of daylight time would have given the enemy an opportunity to strengthen resistance and bring in reinforcements. In addition to the significant Allied superiority in the air and at sea, we had another decisive advantage: the choice of time and place of landing. While we were busy preparing the invasion, the enemy could only wait and wonder where we would land. Not knowing where we would strike, the enemy was forced to disperse his forces along the coast of Europe for 1,400 kilometers. The Germans, who had suffered increasing losses in Russia during the retreat to the west, every day was more and more difficult to defend the Atlantic rampart. To land on the coast, we were enough to concentrate our forces against any one section of the enemy's defences. With our firepower, we could break through this rampart and bring fresh troops into the breach. Although the enemy could not hold us in defensive positions, he could slow our advance while Rommel would pull up reserves. In essence, this was the purpose of the Atlantic rampart. It was to weaken our blow and split our forces. Meanwhile, the enemy could pull up reserves and counterattack. Long-term defenses are invaluable if mobile reserves are concentrated under their cover. Without mobile reserves, however, they lose all value. It was as a result of the lack of mobile reserves that the Maginot Line became a trap for the French army. During a staff game at St. Paul's School, Montgomery informed us that Rommel usually puts reserves into action as soon as they come into his possession. If he, after our breakthrough, will adhere to this tactic, then we will be able to defeat his reserves in pieces and avoid the danger of a strong counterattack from the enemy. Germany, having exhausted its forces in the war against the Red Army, sought to reduce the number of troops in the west by strengthening the fortifications of the Atlantic rampart. This task was entrusted to Rommel, guarding the coast from the Frisian islands of Holland to the mouth of the Loire. With characteristic energy, Rommel increased the number of gun casemates, using thousands of cubic meters of concrete for this purpose. He also employed two effective novelties, which gave us difficulty in landing in Normandy. One of them we discovered in February during an aerial survey of the coast at the invasion site. Rommel ordered the construction of underwater obstacles on the coast, located at the level of the midpoint of the tide, so that they broke the bottoms of the Allied landing craft as they approached the coast. The 51 aircraft of the reconnaissance squadrons photographed these obstacles on a strafing flight. Then, to prevent gliders from landing, he ordered poles to be dug into the ground in the areas of Normandy most convenient for gliders to land. A wire was strung between the poles, to which were attached the triggers of anti-tank mines. We also discovered the barrages against the gliders by means of aerial reconnaissance. Ridgway brought me aerial photographs with a concerned face. At the same time, Rommel covered the coast and uplands with anti-tank minefields, which he placed with the same skill with which he used them during the war in Libya. By the spring of 1944, part of the Allied strategic air forces had been diverted to tactical tasks. The enemy was now deprived of mobility, not only through the destruction of industrial facilities, and in particular oil refineries, but also through bombing attacks on railway communications, marshalling yards and the rest of the continent. While the intelligence continued to guess about the reserves that the enemy will be able to pull up to the invasion areas, the aviation took action that confused all the calculations of intelligence. Nevertheless, in order not to miscalculate, we were very cautious in assessing the results of these bombardments. Any delay of enemy reserves through the actions of aviation was to our advantage. However, when planning the transfer of troops to the bridgehead, we proceeded from the maximum variant of the enemy's concentration of its reserves. From the very beginning of the air offensive, it was in a deadlock as a result of divergence of views among the Air Command. Some believed that the first priority should be bombed railway communications, others plants of synthetic fuels. In the end, Toysparts insisted on the priority bombing of synthetic fuel plants. Subsequent events showed that he was right, for by the time of our invasion of France, the enemy was in dire need of fuel. Motor transports of enemy troops by road became increasingly rare. It came to the point that we began to see serviceable vehicles abandoned by the enemy on the road for lack of fuel. Paraphrasing the famous saying of Napoleon in relation to modern conditions, we can say the movement of troops depends not on the stomach, but on the availability of fuel. It is easier to satiate a hungry stomach with food than to satisfy an internal combustion engine that needs constant nourishment. During our offensive in France, an infantry division consumed 6 times as much fuel and an armoured division 8 times as much food. On 14th April, after bitter arguments with the British over the use of strategic aviation, Eisenhower secured that the Allied air effort be concentrated to directly support Operation Overlord. Over the next 5 weeks, air strikes increased in terrifying proportions. In April alone, bombers and fighters of the 8th Air Army made 33,000 aircraft sorties. In main air battles over Europe, more than 1,000 enemy aircraft were shot down. Our pilots allowed German aircraft to stay in the air only as long as they were not in the crosshairs. As compounds of strategic and tactical aviation, rising daily from British airfields, struck the enemy continuously, he more and more lost his mobility. Only in May, the Air Force destroyed 900 steam locomotives and 16,000 freight cars. In addition, dozens of marshalling yards were put out of action during daylight targeted bombardments. Even when we corrected the data of some pilots who tended to exaggerate the results of bombing, still the results were impressive, so impressive that we ceased to fear the rapid concentration of enemy reserves. In pursuit of the goal of isolating the landing area, the Air Force first bombed the northwestern part of France and then disrupted its communications with the rest of the country. The area bombed was roughly the size of the state of Indiana. Its boundary ran from Le Havre up the Seine to Paris, then down to Orleans at the headwaters of the Loire, running along that river to Nantes, located on the south side of the base of the Brittany Peninsula. This westernmost part of France was defended by the German 7th Army. This army was one of 2 armies that were part of Rommel's army group. The army consisted of 17 divisions, not counting the garrisons stationed at Cherbourg and in the ports of the Brittany Peninsula. And of the 17 divisions, 3 were armoured divisions, which were held in reserve. By the end of the spring of 1944, there were only 58 German divisions in France, of which 10 were panzer and grenadier motorized divisions. They were extremely heterogeneous in terms of combat capability and mobility. 17 divisions were field divisions and were intended for counterattacks. Most of them, however, had long been without transport, except for the essentials. They therefore lacked the mobility required in maneuver warfare. The 24 coastal defense divisions were also extremely heterogeneous in their composition and possessed even less mobility because of the lack of transport. The remaining 7 divisions were training formations manned primarily by recruits. Isolating the site of the landing of the sea landing from the area of Pas de Calais and Bordeaux, where the Germans concentrated large forces, the Allied Air Command hoped to prevent the approach of German reinforcements, while we conducted operations against the 7th German Army. We hoped to be able to destroy this army before the arrival of reinforcements. Simultaneously with the isolation of the northwestern part of France, aviation strikes also in Normandy, disrupting railway communications and paralyzing road transport. This prevented Rommel from closing the ring of encirclement around our bridgehead before we realized the breakthrough. Air action was so successful that one enemy division, to engage, was forced to make a march of 160-kilometer march. At the beginning of the air action to destroy bridges in France, I had patience to wait for the results of the bombardment. I had already seen in Tunisia, as once German dive bombers Ju-87 repeatedly bombing tried to destroy a small-gauge bridge Bailey, and nothing they did not succeed. In London itself, despite the Blitzkrieg of 1940, no bridges were destroyed on the Thames. However, now the Air Command, instead of pouring bombs from high-altitude bridges, which seemed from above the size of a pencil, sent fighter bombers to bomb the bridge's foundations. By 4th June, all the railway bridges on the Seine between Rouen and Paris had been destroyed. By 6th June, not only was the entire northwestern part of France isolated, but the bombing had also paralyzed the French railway network. The capacity of the railways was reduced to 60%, which particularly affected an army deprived of motor transport. In order to test the organization of fire, communications and engineer service units on the coast, we planned to conduct dress rehearsals for the landing of troops at Omaha and Utah in late April and early May. To create the realistic situation that awaited us on the Normandy coast, we designated for training the coast near the village of Slapton Sands in Devonshire, a few kilometres south of the British naval base at Dartmouth. Meanwhile, the invasion troops had been moved from their camps and bivouacs in southwest England to areas of concentration a short distance from the Channel. They thus made their first march towards the ports of embarkation. In these areas, the troops sealed their fighting vehicles, received special equipment, and were relieved of all surplus property. From the staging areas, the troops proceeded to the forward areas, nicknamed sausages for their oblong shape. Not far from the forward areas were sandy stretches of coastline and specially made reinforced concrete ramps for loading troops onto landing craft. To recruit the 54,000 men needed for economic and technical services in the areas of concentration of troops, had to disband an entire armoured division. The service units had 4,500 specially trained cooks. The forward areas were surrounded by barbed wire as the troops received there their final briefing on their tasks. Once they were briefed on the task ahead, they were not allowed to communicate with the local population. Civilian vehicles were not allowed in the coastal area, checkpoints were set up on the roads, and 2,000 counterintelligence agents were sent to the coastal zone to prevent the disclosure of military secrets. Conducting training landings involved some risk, as we had to concentrate landing craft in harbours. However, despite these obvious signs of preparations for invasion, German aircraft hardly bothered us at all. The forward areas were carefully camouflaged, and the movement of military transport was so dispersed that the enemy did not notice our troop movements. I was on board an infantry landing craft. At the bow of the vessel, which was 37 meters long, assault ladders were attached to the sides. The ship was burying its bow in the waves of the choppy English Channel as we passed the transports into Start Bay, where we wanted to watch a training landing at the Utah site. Although it was already 28th April, the wind was whipping painfully at our faces and the spray was pouring down the panes of our binoculars, which were aimed at the foggy shore. On a narrow strip of white coastline, we could see a group of cottages, half shrouded in the haze of the foggy morning. It was the village of Slapton Sands. Lieutenant General Louis Brereton, commander of the 9th Tactical Air Army, stood on the bridge of an infantry landing craft that looked like a turret. He looked up at the cloud-covered sky and hid his head deeper into the collar of his overcoat. The aircraft that were supposed to strike the coast were already running late. Do you think they will get through the clouds? I asked. Brereton shrugged his shoulders. If the planes are above the clouds now, they'd better return to their bases, I said, pointing binoculars at the ships approaching the coast. At this late date, they might hit our troops. Brereton's reply was drowned out by the rumble of bursts. One of the ships seemed to have exploded off the coast, leaving behind them smoke tails, missiles with a whistle cut through the sky, and on the grey, fog-shrouded coast sparkled bursts. There was a rumble over the bay. It was our first ship with a rocket launcher fired at the coast at close range before the landing. In the evening, Collins informed me that German torpedo boats had broken through the guard and attacked the convoy on its way to Slapton Sands. The report said that one or more ships had been damaged. I asked if there had been casualties, and was told that there had been casualties, but what kind it could not be ascertained exactly. Only after the troops were assembled at the end of the exercise could the exact losses be ascertained. Meanwhile, the intelligence department showed growing concern. If the enemy torpedo boats picked up survivors from the sunken ships, then the enemy could learn about the impending invasion date. We had prudently drawn up a plan to disinform the enemy in advance, according to which the invasion was scheduled for mid-July. Fortunately, the troops involved in the exercise had not yet been briefed, and the enemy apparently did not know where we would invade France. However, as a result of the sinking of our ships, the enemy could have learnt when we were going to strike. Therefore, I too shared the fears of the intelligence department. Weeks passed, and no one else reported the incident to me. I decided that the casualties were small and it was unlikely that the enemy would have learnt anything. On the way back to Dartmouth, I shared my observations of the exercise with Keane, Dixon, Thorson, and Wilson. They, like myself, were concerned about two circumstances. The engineering units that had equipped the coast had failed to do their job, and the Air Force had not participated at all. The first deficiency we could remedy with our own forces, for the reasons were clear to us. As for the second shortcoming, the matter was much more complicated. Brereton, apparently not at all worried about the fact that the aviation did not fulfill its task. Engineering and Landing Brigade is engaged in the equipment of the coast to facilitate the landing of troops, transport and storage of goods unloaded on the coast, the regulation of traffic. Shortcomings in the activities of this unit can not only jeopardize the landing, but also slow down the accumulation of reserves on the bridgehead. During the critical period of the landing operation, until Cherbourg was captured and the communications zone was organized, the coast unequipped to receive cargoes could jeopardize the entire operation. I suggested to Collins that he pick a new engineer landing brigade commander to equip the coast at the Utah landing site. It was not until 4 years into the war that I learned that the shortcomings in the engineering equipment of the coast during the training landing at the Utah site were not the fault of the commander of the Engineer Airborne Brigade. They resulted from an attack by German torpedo boats. The incident, which I viewed as a small skirmish with the enemy, turned out to be one of the major tragedies of the war in Europe. German torpedo boats sank 2 tank landing craft, killing over 700 people for reasons unknown to me. No one reported it to me. Collins' losses in the exercise exceeded those of his troops at the Utah site on the first day of the Normandy landings. If our faith in air support had been measured by the indifference shown to us by the 9th Tactical Air Army in England, we would have embarked on the landing operation with great apprehension. Part of our misgivings were due to Brereton's own arrogant attitude towards ground troops. When we tried to convince him of the need for joint training of aviation and ground forces, we were given to understand that all aviation thrown into the battle for France. If he had any idea of the importance of joint training of air and ground forces, he did not show it in any way. To be fair to Brereton, however, it must be remembered that while we were busy planning the invasion and preparing troops, the 9th Air Army was engaged in an air offensive against the launching pads of shell planes. The 9th Air Army was organised in England in October 1943 after the separation of the Tactical Air Command from the 8th Air Army. From January 1944, it began to take part in air battles over Europe under the overall command of Lee Mallory, Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. Since the 9th Air Army was not to support ground troops until after the invasion, it participated in air operations in conjunction with heavy bombers all spring, denying German aircraft the use of forward airfields. Having established the locations of the launching pads of enemy shell planes, the 8th and 9th Air Armies concentrated much of their efforts against these sites. Despite the tendency of intelligence to underestimate the capabilities of missile weapons, we feared that the enemy might use missiles against our crowded ports while troops were being loaded onto ships. In the 6 months before the invasion, Allied aviation flew 30,000 aircraft against launch sites. Only a month before the invasion, the command of the 9th Air Army reported that it had finished air operations and could begin joint training with ground troops. Unfortunately, I replied, we have already completed our training. Troops are moving to the forward areas. Having failed to cooperate with the Air Force in England, we landed in France without being prepared for joint action. We were fortunate that at the head of the 9th Tactical Air Command, supporting the 1st Army, was energetic and young Major General Elwood Quesada. This 40-year-old general more than anyone else helped us to organize the interaction between ground troops and air forces, which gave us the opportunity to sweep across France so rapidly after the breakthrough in Normandy. He excelled in a way that other air commanders had not, partly because he was not afraid to take risks. Unlike most air commanders who saw the need to support ground forces as an unnecessary distraction from the war in the air, Quesada approached the issue as an uncharted area of great opportunity. During the invasion across the Channel, Montgomery was to be stationed with the Allied air and naval commanders-in-chief at Eisenhower's Portsmouth headquarters. From here, Eisenhower could exercise direct control over the actions of his 3 principal commanders. Initially, it was planned that on the first day of the operation I will be in England and direct the landing operations of the 1st Army from an underground command post near Plymouth. Later, this option was dropped and I was ordered to be together with Montgomery in Portsmouth. This was justified by the fact that in case of complication of the situation could require joint action. However, this motivation seemed to me unreasonable, and I reported it to Ike. If there are difficulties in landing the landing force, I told him, the decisions will be made aboard Kirk's flagship. That ship is our communications center, and that's where I'm supposed to be. If anything happens on the coast, I'd rather be able to direct from the ship than from England. Ike agreed with my arguments, and I prepared to board the ship. By 31st May, more than 250,000 ground troops were concentrated in the forward areas, training, familiarizing themselves with the coming operation and preparing for the day of the invasion.